Добрый день.
Good afternoon. I welcome all those who are watching us live.
И сегодня у нас
And today we have an
очень важная
exciting and very important topic,
надзорного стресс-тестирования. И для начала я хотела бы
regulatory stress
сформулировать
testing,
свое видение и свое отношение к этому.
supervisory test testing. And I'd like to
Надзорный
say what I mean by it.
является
First of all,
очень важным и существенным дополнением к уже
it's a major tool
существующим
in addition
надзорным инструментам,
to
и оно дает
regulatory instruments, and it gives an opportunity to the regulator, to the supervisor, to have a deep understanding of the ability of the banks to survive during crises.
Вы знаете, мне в голову пришла пословица, русская пословица «Готовься, а не с лета», и если
It's
применять к надзорному
like getting ready for something well in advance.
готовьте антикризис.
So we need to have anti-crisis plans long before a crisis is here and use an efficient tool of supervisory stress testing.
Банк России проводит надзорное стресс-тестирование уже не
The Bank of Russia has been doing stress testing for more than a year. We've been using this exercise exclusively in research purposes, and today I'd like to talk about whether it's possible to use the outcomes of regulatory stress testing in practice, in a hands-on way. This year, we launched stress testing using bottom-up tests. We've done it over a couple of years. We've now received answers from top 30 banks. And the summer is ahead of us, so we'll spend this time on discussing it with the banks, and in September we will publish a detailed report. It will feature stylized results. So far, we're not ready to disclose these results on each of the market participants. Now I'd like you to bring up the slide on the screen to show the evolution of using supervisory stress testing here in Russia. Since 2015, we've introduced this requirement concerning ICAP, and stress testing is an important element of this process. In 2018, introduced measures for systemically important banks. They need to come up with financial recovery plans. And stress testing is a major component of this process. They've been using a very high-stress scenario. And since 2016, for research purposes, we've been running stress tests involving banks. Over this time, we've used different banks for this exercise. And today, let's talk of how we can move from just using it for research to use it for practical purposes. And we've invited our distinguished speakers who are participants of regulatory supervisory stress testing. We have two representatives of major banks, Jangir Jangirov, Senior Vice President, Head of Risks at Sberbank, at Sber, and Andrei Guletsky, Head of Risk at Alfa Bank. And international experience is important for us too. So this is why today we have two representatives from the EU and the US. They have hands-on experience in using supervisory stress testing. Borhard Ekes from PricewaterhouseCoopers in Germany, and Till Schurman, senior partner at Oliver Wyman in the US. And before we go to our debate, actually, I would like to run the first poll for our audience.
И звучит он следующим образом. Как вы оцениваете готовность Банка
How do you assess the
будет использовать надзорные
level of preparedness of the banks
банковского надзора.
when the central bank will start using supervisory stress testing
В конце нашего
in earnest, not just for research purposes.
хочу
So
адресовать
the first question goes to the person who is currently in the room, that's the representatives of the banking sector. So 2020 was a difficult year for everyone. 2020 will be etched in our memory forever. Well, I thought it was supposed to bring luck, good luck to all of us, but it brought trials and tribulations to all of us. And we as a regulator have come to a conclusion not to add any extra burden to you, to ease your life, and we didn't use supervisory stress testing, but we did it on our own. And it was indeed very useful to understand how the banking sector could fare in a crisis situation, how individual banks would fare in a crisis situation. So how did you use stress testing during the crisis to manage these processes at the bank? Jahangir, let's start with you.
Да, спасибо за вопрос, Ольга Васильевна. Ну, пожалуй, прошлый год был звездным.
Thank you for this question. Last year was the prime time for scenario analysis and for stress testing in particular. All of the investment that were done by all the other banks in this have proven that it was worthy. Actually, if you don't have these toolkit, you don't have the foundation for risk management. What is risk management? Risk management is protection of the organization, I mean bank or any other company, protection from the maximum range of scenarios. As you said, we need to be ready for everything in advance. Yes, you take decision today on what you will do if these scenarios materialize going forward. So you either avoid, you prevent, or you should do something. And those companies that had that cool toolkit, they were on the winning side, on the winning end. I consulted my colleagues how many scenarios we ran last year. It was more than 20. I thought it was about 20, but it turned out it was more than 20 scenarios, and it all started in February 2020, when we saw what was happening with COVID-19 around the world. I think you only had 2 cases in Russia, so the pandemic didn't really reach us in full. So in February we started doing our first stress test. And then we refined our analysis, we fine-tuned it, and last year we faced 2 main challenges, groundbreaking challenges. First, we had to invent all these scenarios ourselves. So it's usually a microeconomic stress test, like oil price, and that's it. Or GDP decline, something related to macroeconomics usually. So last year we had to come up with our own scenarios of how the pandemic would evolve, what kind of lockdowns we would have, what central banks would do, what governments would do. We had to invent them ourselves. So it was quite a creative job. And the second big challenge was to define the time horizon. Yeah, usually have 1 month or something like this, but sometimes you only had a week. The shortest stress test was 1.5 days. So we started doing it on Friday in the afternoon, and we had the right outcomes, the necessary outcomes in late Saturday. So it was quite a creative exercise, although a difficult one. And we also had several stress tests, and the second group was ESG, transport carbon regulation. It was an important scenario because it would apply to Russia in a heavy way. And second, related to the energy, that's sustainable development scenario of how it will impact the Russian economy and on our credit portfolio. And we're continuing this work at the moment.
Международное энергетическое агентство выпустило новый сценарий Net Zero 2050.
And so there's Net Zero 2050 scenario.
Принципиально новый. Здесь тоже, на самом деле, приходится придумывать, потому что только
And we have to, invent a lot by ourselves because there is no universal scenario of how the world would evolve by 2050. So we have to think of where it will go ourselves. Thank you, Jahangir. It's great to use this tool. It's great to have this tool. It would be a mistake not to use it. And the fact that you had run scenarios for more than 20 times, well, I'm sure you had it. And the regulator spared you. He didn't have the 21st test. Over to you, Andrei.
Ну, у нас в чем-то... Я не берусь сказать, сколько сценариев мы прогнали.
Well, I can't give you an exact figure. I think it's slower than 20. And we really appreciate that the central bank didn't add any new scenarios.
Наш подход был принципиально.
We had plenty, on our plate. But we had a different approach. The first thing we started off, the first concern we had
Собственно говоря, кризис коронавируса.
when the crisis hit us
Это была ликвидность.
was liquidity.
С чем мы изучали, это как могут себя повести, соответственно, корпорации
How would corporates and individuals behave in terms of their
Банк изначально
cash,
подходил более консервативно.
whether they would withdraw or keep it. And the bank has always been more conservative than the central bank, actually. And we ran several scenarios, and
Часть нашего риск-аппетита применительно к стрессовой ликвидности.
we actually
После того, как
run some stress tests for our liquidity.
с ликвидностью все должно быть нормально, следующее, чем мы занялись,
Now, we made sure that everything would be fine with liquidity. Then business continuity.
стресс-тестирование, то есть мы
It's
поняли,
also a major part of stress testing. We realized that the bank would be liquid. And the next thing we did was to make sure that the bank would be able to continue running smoothly. And so we had several scenarios of business continuity, business different functions, so that we wouldn't have more than 50% of our staff critically ill. We realized that we could still do something remotely.
вот мы, наверное, не были так сильно готовы.
And we were not really that well prepared, because to a certain extent we only responded in a reactive way.
Сценария пандемии,
We didn't have in our BCP plans the pandemic scenario, and we had to
на лету и действовать творчески.
think about it on the fly and to invent this scenario on the fly.
Собственно говоря,
So when we realized that the bank could still continue running smoothly,
вот основой это именно стресс-тестирование кредитного.
we did this stress test for the credit risk.
Мы прогоняли разного рода
And we also had to run several scenarios,
синтетического сценария.
but it was a kind of a synthetic, a hybrid scenario. Jahangir said they tried to invent some big picture
Которая внутренне, наверное, консистентна.
that would be consistent internally. We didn't try to
Мы просто
do that.
впрямую делали синтетический
We
сценарий.
just ran synthetic scenarios. Let's say
А если в 4, а если в таком секторе, а если в другом? Ну,
let's say that would have to downgrade some loan quality for a lot of borrowers, and we did it
как мы убедились, что
several times,
будет устойчив,
and then we
тем не менее, вот
realized, okay, the bank would still be resilient.
стресс-тестирование для меня это всегда некое
Stress testing for me
сверху.
is always a bird's eye view, bird's eye assessment. It means that the management is passive. It doesn't
Выдачами он не управляет.
manage
Регулятор
newly originated loans, and the regulator would be passive. The regulator doesn't help you.
на практике, конечно, это не
Well,
так.
in practice, it would all be different, and 2020 proved that. The regulator really helped us, and the bank's management was on board. They helped to cut costs. They helped to
2020 год оказался неплохим с точки зрения.
cut any other costs related to it.
Ну, мне трудно представить себе,
Thank you, Andrei.
когда регулятор будет...
Well, it's hard to imagine a scenario where the regulator would be passive.
Хотя, когда проводишь...
Well, when you run tests, definitely you need to factor in all of these scenarios, all of the possible failures and disasters. Thank you. And I'd like to ask our experts from abroad. I do remember that supervisory stress testing was a response to the crisis of 2008, and the EU and the US have actively used supervisory stress testing. And my first question is to Burkhard. Burkhard, could you share your experience? What's taking place at the EU? How supervisory stress testing is done? What is the evolution of that process there?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be in this panel. I tried to summarize the actual status of the EU-wide stress tests, including the objective and also the reform discussions we have now in a slide, which hopefully can now be shared with you. The stress test has started in the EU in 2011, and at that time 90 banks have been involved and included in the stress test. And at that time, it was decided to have a threshold. The threshold was 5% of the CET1 ratio, and 8% failed. That means we are below the 5%, and 16 banks between 5 and 6%. And very interestingly, the next stress test, which happened in 2014, the second one has included 123 banks, so even more. And on average, the CET1 ratio have been increased up to 8.5% as a result of the stress test, on average, in comparison to almost 7% in 2011. And then the EU-wide stress test exercise has evolved over time according to the developments of the market and the European regulatory framework. And in particular, the pass-fail approach was overcome in 2016, when the overall progress in banks' financial conditions allowed the focus of regulators to shift from the identification of immediate recapitalization needs to the assessment of potential vulnerabilities. What you see on the slide in 2016, on average, the CET1 ratio drops by 380 basis points to 9.4%, which is higher than in 2014. And in 2018, it was 395 basis points. The CET1 ratio dropped down, and it was 10.1%. Now we are in the actual stress test 2021, which was postponed due to COVID-19 from 2020 to 2021. And the results will be expected by the end of July. So unfortunately, today I cannot tell you what the outcome is. But the plan is to publish all the results of all the banks who are participating. And those banks which are in the samples, the European Banking Authority, there will be a very, very detailed publication, more than 1,000 data points. And those ones which are not included in the EBA stress test, which will be done only by ECB, or there's also publication foreseen, which around 10 basis points. It means the one who are under EBA have 100 times more data points, which will be published and available for the impact. In 2021, the methodology remained more or less the same to the years before. The only thing is what has been changed, that they cancel out the mitigation effects of COVID-19 moratorias and state aid. The EBA clearly said, let's take this out. And what is then the realistic view on the banks? Which then leads to staging from stage 1 to stage 2. Now, the objectives of the stress program, always have been identifying risks and vulnerabilities, which clearly was an outcome. It was much easier for ECB and the other competent authorities to identify the risk and the vulnerabilities. It was also has also clearly the impact of strengthen the market discipline, and especially for those banks who are using the market, and to demonstrate them how good or how weak they are. The supervisory toolkit was also to assess the bank's resilience challenging capital positions, and especially to determine the Pillar 2 guidance add-on. And then also it was fostering the stress test capabilities regarding the testing, but also the risk management capabilities. And if you then compare what have been the benefits with regards to the drawbacks of the current EBA stress test framework. So the benefits clearly it contributes to improving the EU banking sector's resilience, especially with bottom-up approach. pushing the banks to invest in and improve their risk models and allow supervisors to better understand the mechanics of banks' internal models and projections in relation to their business models and risk profile. That is the bottom up. The other benefits were that the use of backstops and overrides in form of constraints and supervisory quality assurance, also to ensure comparability amongst the banks. And it was also very positively seen that the stress testing was run simultaneously across a large number of banks against a common baseline and adverse scenarios. And it clearly has increased the transparency across the wide sample of EU banks by disclosing granular information on bank-by-bank basis. But the drawbacks were also clearly seen. There was a lack of clarity and prioritization of the EU-wide stress test objectives, with a number of conflicting objectives. The EU-wide stress test relatively was less integrated in the supervisory process if you compare it to the US or UK. And the lack of integration can be, for example, due to some methodological constraints, such as a static balance sheet assumption, which does not consider management actions, make it difficult to convert the stress test capital depletion into meaningful supervisory capital add-on. And especially the criticism is very high on these balance sheet assumptions, which requires banks to maintain their balance sheet numbers constant with respect to the reference date for in use 3 years. The other one was also, as a drawback, the insufficient information on the implications of the stress test for other supervisory decisions. So what is the outcome on that? And it was very resource intensive nature of the exercise for all parties which were involved. And this has led now to reform of the stress test program, which is still in discussion. The paper has been published last year, and the plan is to finalize this year. And what they are looking at is that they want to do a combination of a bank leg and a supervisory leg. That means the starting point will be a common scenario and also harmonized starting points. And in the bank leg, there will be a less constrained bottom-up approach. That means banks can remove some constraints and can explain it, and no quality assurance by supervisors, but the basic data checks on starting points, and it will be owned by the banks. And in parallel, there's a supervisory leg, and supervisory leg is a more constrained bottom-up approach, and also top-down approach. And the quality assured by the supervisors, and the results are owned by the supervisors. And then the two results will be used in two ways. The bank leg results will be used for transparency and also for market discipline. That means it will be published. And the supervisory leg results will be based for the determination of P2G. And at the end, the publication will be granular disclosures for the banks and limited disclosures for the supervisory leg. That is more or less what is still in discussion, which has not been finally decided. But the reasons are very important, and the aim is very clear: to become more relevant for the markets, to make it even more comparable. The transparency, especially the link between stress test results and the supervisory action, will become more clearer. And also, what is also quite important, the flexibility to identify idiosyncratic risks. For example, the corporate culture, operating strategy, financial politics, and investment strategy as well. All that is now in discussion.
Thank you so much.
Очень такой содержательный,
Very extensive overview, very substantive overview of the evolution of stress testing in the European system. It's a very useful one for us. We'll go back to you to discuss the process itself, and you made the right focus. It needs to be effectively established, effectively built. You said that some of the big banks have not passed stress testing. And I know that it applies not just to the European system, but the same was in the US. There were some precedents in the US when big banks actually failed they failed those stress test criteria. And I'd like to ask a question to Till. Could you please share your experience? What was the consequences of the fact that the banks didn't pass the stress test? How did it impact financial stability?
Of course. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent conference. It really is an honor to be here with you today. So thank you. So I think we've learned already in the discussion that stress testing is primarily an information tool. So you learn about the resiliency of banks to large shocks and to large stresses. This is critical, especially in crisis, or if you will, in financial wartime, when there's a lot of uncertainty about the banks, about the economy, and even about the supervisors or the government of being able to provide support to the banks if it is needed. So if I may, I'm going to just share with you a slide that shows the picture of the U.S. experience. So the U.S. has had about a dozen tests so far since the original one in 2009 during the crisis. It's actually been 13 tests. 2011 was not disclosed, and in 2020 we actually had 2 tests. So if you look on the left, the SCAP, which was the Supervisory Capital Assessment Program in 2009, the original crisis stress test, actually more than half the banks did not pass. I think this is quite an important observation, because it showed that there was, in some sense, the willingness to reveal the depth of the problem at the time in the US banking system. There was the advantage of having a large backstop, the TARP program, in case the banks were not able to raise capital on their own. Over time, this regime has evolved quite substantially, from including in 2013 with the introduction of qualitative failure. And in fact, we have not seen any quantitative failure since 2014. The idea of qualitative failure is to essentially say, now that we are no longer in a crisis, so if you will, we're in financial peacetime, and the worst is behind us, the financial system is stable. So now the view in the US was, we can focus our attention more on the qualitative aspects, risk management capabilities, and so on, and make sure that those are also at a level that is required and expected. For several years, there were qualitative failures almost every year. Since 2017, we have the regional banks were no longer subject to the qualitative assessment, and we haven't really seen any qualitative failures of any kind since 2019. However, that's 10 years after the financial crisis, and it shows that the view, at least by the US authorities, was that capital is not a substitute for poor risk management, that in financial peacetime, once financial stability has been reached, capital is not quite enough. You also need very solid risk management processes. So I think that shows you kind of the richness and the possibilities of what stress testing can bring, both in a crisis and wartime, to restore stability. That's easier to do if there is a financial backstop, which was the European regime system did not have the benefit of in 2011, 2012, and 13 during the sovereign crisis. I hope that is helpful.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's very useful information. I fully agree with your statement that capital stock would not be a universal saver unless you have good management in a bank, and unless you have a better than average risk management practice in the bank. Now, coming to the point about the processes of organizing and administering stress testing, we already heard that it should be efficient and less costly to the bank, and regulators should also be quite organic and experienced in doing such stress testing. We actually tried to more or less synchronize our stress testing with the bottom-up approach and with the other methods, and so that by the end of the year we would be better prepared to our stress testing, and that so that you can also take into account our scenarios as well as the other AML-CFT initiatives. Jahangir Andrei may be in that same sequence. Can you comment on whether you are able to reach a synergy when you more or less estimate your performance under stress testing with different scenarios? Of course, the toolkit that is used, the models and processes, they are very much similar. The regulator wants us to do stress testing in the probably different focus there. Accentuating some other risks than those seen by the banks themselves. And I think that here we heard that it is important to think about the goal of stress testing. Our goal, or our objective, is to really look for our vulnerabilities and the analysis of such vulnerabilities and to decide what it can come to. The regulator is taking a broader view, not of an individual bank, but of the system overall, and maybe the regulator sees some other aspects of the whole situation. So stress testing really can be perceived in different ways. However, the toolkits are very much similar. Several things to mention here. Undoubtedly, this is the process. In a situation when you need to come up with scenarios and to apply those scenarios, the bad beginning is for people to start recalling what needs to be done. It's good to have resources allocated, and it's risk management and in marketing, in strategy and finance, etc., etc. We do have some bits and pieces of resources, but they all need to work as a team so that they would know the sequence of action. It's good to have resources already allocated or pre-allocated so that you don't really forget about your strategic tasks and start immediately doing the stress testing. It's good to have some available resources for stress testing there. So now, if stress testing takes a lot of time, this is already an issue of not only procedures and processes, but of the very essence that the bank is doing. If you do have too many manual operations and handling of data, then it is no good. The quality of the outcome would not be then good either. And we did 2 scenarios in sequence last year for stress testing, and actually we took a different view at the very process of stress testing and the way automation may be used and models may be used. When you more or less take 2 scenarios, it is quite different from, taking 20 scenarios within 1 month. And the third point is it is important for all the intermediate results of stress testing to be kept and archived, I would say, so that if there are any proposals and suggestions from the regulator or from somebody else, those should be taken down and if need be, retrieved. When the central bank wants to do more frequent stress testing so that those stress tests are comparable. It is important for the banks to submit to you all those intermediate results and analyses. So models, automation, and overall guidance about archiving and documenting all those intermediate results so that they can be retrieved in future. Andrei, well, indeed, here I would take a different view. In our case, stress testing is part of our business planning. It starts sometime in the end of summer and then finishes sometime in November. And the very process of stress testing is actually used to try to understand our risk appetites, our buffers that are needed. So the focus there is not on the continuity of business or liquidity, but rather on capital and risks. And in principle, we are going through a number of scenarios. We are not such a big bank as Sberbank. We do have a more specialized portfolio. But in this sense, of course, we are prepared to support the regulator. If, say, the regulator wants to run through some systemic scenarios, our system is ready, and as part of our annual planning, we would be prepared to, to go through the scenarios that are important and interesting to the regulator. Jahangir also mentioned synergy. We would try to understand what is important to us and what would be important to the regulator in this sense. And of course, these are complementary things. Well, the infrastructure is the same, I would say, and indeed we are taking down all those intermediate results, and we are taking down the notes. Thank you. Indeed, my next question was about
мерами, которые регулятор
the measures and policies that the regulator can use and apply based on the results of stress testing. And the question that we received from the audience was exactly about what I wanted to ask our experts about. And the question is, the foreign regulators, based on the stress testing results, can punish banks. In Russia, we don't have such a power. Yes, indeed, our Russian regulation does not really provide for the opportunity to apply some sanctions or punishments. But we are thinking about this. We are thinking about this as part of our improvement of stress testing. Perhaps we would come to a point when we would have to really answer this challenge. Now we can take some action, say, for example, a markup on the capital requirements, and when we assess the capital adequacy of banks, and we can introduce more stringent measures and requirements there, and we can also recommend banks not to pay up their dividends when we see that the buffer ratios are breached. And my question is to Till and Burkhard. Can you tell us, we know that in the US and in the European Union there is some practice of taking action on the basis of the results and the outcome of stress testing. Some individual plans in the EU or in England, they are also introducing some stricter requirements for capital adequacy, for example. My question is, what can be applicable for the Russian banking sector, in your opinion? Which way to follow, do you think, in terms of, using some action on the basis of the performance results of stress testing? Burkhard, please, maybe you can go first.
Yeah. I mean, the ECB has decided, and also EBA has decided, when they publish this year's stress test results, 2021, they only will do qualitative measures afterwards, which means regarding the process, regarding the data quality, those kind of things. And as in the past, they will do a P2G. Yeah, that means a Pillar 2 guidance on that. And the reason why they prefer this, let's say, capital add-on instead of include this in the ICAP is that they are more flexible. Yeah? Which means if a bank, for example, breaches the P2G and is still above the P2R, then there are still some time, let's say, to do actions and to do measures. The other one is also that the ECB wants to have a buffer to the MDA trigger, to the maximum distributable amount one, which was very helpful, especially last year, COVID-19. As you know, the banks have not been, let's say, allowed to pay dividends just to keep the capital, and some banks really breached the P2G. Still above the MDA, which makes them more flexible. And ECB also has decided to keep these reliefs regarding the allowance of breaching the P2G guidance till the end of next year. So that was more or less the reason to have an additional buffer. The P2G will not be published officially, or there is no obligation to publish this. Yeah. So, but the market knows there is an additional buffer. The banks have to fulfill, otherwise the ECB would start. And the other point, which also could be considered, and this really depends on I would say, on the actual CET1 situation of the banks, is to include this in the ICAP. Yeah. And ECB is always saying ICAP informs the P2R, the P2 requirements, yeah. But that means then you have no flexibility because P2R always has to fulfill, no doubt about it, which then could also lead in special circumstances, as we had in COVID-19, to some negative feedback. And please have also in mind, this has at least worked very well in the EU, because if you look at the development or the evolution of the results of the stress test, then you can see from year to year, the negative impact of the stress test has increased. That means the basis points have increased, yeah. But on the other side, the average CET1 ratio after stress tests have also increased, yeah, which is a clear signal that the capital requirements are very good at this level. And then maybe it makes more sense to go for P2G. Yeah. That's so far from my side.
Спасибо, Бурхард. Тиль, пожалуйста.
Thank you.
Thank you, Till.
So the US stress test is a capital planning exercise. If you think about what is one of the biggest differences between wartime and peacetime stress testing, you can think about crisis stress testing, wartime stress testing as how much capital needs to go into a bank. And so then peacetime is, well, how much can we afford to let a bank let capital out of the bank? And in that sense, it always involves a capital planning exercise. And so in the US, ICAP and supervisory stress testing is combined at the same time into one exercise. I think the US regime is the only one that combines those two. Now, this has some advantages and some disadvantages. Some of the advantages are the fact that the simultaneity, the fact that you're doing it at the same time, allows for easier comparison across banks for similar portfolios and similar activities. It leverages and takes advantage of probably the only informational advantage that a supervisor has over the banks, because the banks always know more about their own risks than the supervisor. And that is the ability to compare across banks, which is an ability that the banks do not have. And so it is useful for the supervisor to essentially leverage that advantage. So it allows the supervisor to benchmark bank internal stress testing capabilities, especially the choice and the severity of the scenario with the supervisory view. So you could ask very concretely, is the bank being conservative enough? And it provides useful insight into what the banks collectively and individually view as their important risks, and they may be different from what the supervisor does. But there are also disadvantages to this simultaneity approach, which is that it's a lot of work to do in a very short amount of time. Now, in the US, there have been changes to spread this out over the course of the year, but it's still a lot of work for both the supervisor and the banks to do at the same time. And then secondly, it could result in actually too much influence of the supervisor's view of risks at the expense of the bank's internal views. That is always going to be a tension. And I think it's one of the judgment calls that one has to make, whether to have this simultaneity or not. And it prevents, it's not, I think that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but only to some degree.
Спасибо, Тиль.
Thank you, Till.
Время неумолимо бежит.
Unfortunately, the time is running short, and I am prompted here that we only have 6 minutes to go. Of course, this is a very, very interesting subject that we can discuss endlessly. Now, before I ask the final question to my colleagues here in the studio, let me also make another question to the audience and to all of us. The question is whether you think it feasible to disclose the results of supervisory stress testing with a breakdown to the individual bank in some future, not right now, but looking forward. Would it be feasible and something that is needed? Jangir, what do you think about this? Do you think it would be a good idea to disclose such individual bank-level supervisory stress testing information? And what do you think if, say, a bank would say no to such an idea? Would it be possible for the bank really to say no? And also, as a form of provocation, would you be in agreement to provide such information of your bank? Well, in Europe and in the US, such disclosure is a fact of life, and I don't think that it should be a problem for the Russian banking system to disclose such granular information. There are two aspects to that. First, or two issues that need to be resolved: comparability of stress testing results and performance, so that Sber, Alpha, and others can be compared, so that they would be using the same basic assumptions. And I think that here we're talking about responsibility of the regulator, because only the central bank can more or less make such comparisons and come up with a big picture. But for that, it takes time, maybe a year or two, so that we can live together within one same framework where you would be able to try to level out the whole stress testing system in Russia. And the second point, which is important for such first publications, is that you really need to communicate this to the market, so that you wouldn't have all those, big headlines like in Europe or in the US, that the largest US banks are losing such and such, the scenarios of probability of such losses, or headlines about that this bank failed to go through stress testing, etc. We want to avoid such, an empty-grounded crisis. But otherwise, we are prepared to do that. It is important, though, that it should be universal. It should be, a level playing field for all. It's not that only some individual banks would agree to that. If all agree, then it's okay. Andrei, I agree in much respect to what Jangir said. I like the idea of Till that stress testing is an informational tool, and indeed the way you use information is very important. Overall, we are supportive of the idea that all systemic banks would publish their information, but the stress testing scenarios should be the same then, and some guidance should be there as to how to do stress testing so that we can have comparable results. For example, if results are significantly different, we don't want those to be made public, but rather so that such differences can be discussed between the regulator and the creditor, because the creditor may have a more protected position in relation to some other assets, and then if this and the creditor knows, the lending institution knows about that, but then if this is made public, this may cause some concerns in the market or some turmoil. But we think that such disclosures, given our conservative risk appetite, such an approach can actually be a competitive advantage of sorts in our talks with the rating agencies. Well, thank you very much. Really, opinions were coming from two systemic banks of Russia, which have very good capital stocks and buffers, and which have very good quality of risk management culture. Now I would like the tech support to show us the results of our two surveys with two questions. The first question was about the preparedness of the Russian banking sector to use the supervisory stress testing as an active banking supervision tool. And the prevailing question is that banks are prepared by 27% and they need more time. That is the answer that came from the 72% of the audience. And the second question.
Indeed,
the second question was about the disclosure of this information by banks. 54% of the audience believes that in the foreseeable future such disclosure would be possible, and 45% say that this is not possible. Well, we shall see what we shall see. But we all, as the result of discussing this very important and interesting topic, realize that we need to do stress testing at least, and that we need to be forward-looking, and we need to really take into account not only any positive scenarios or our dreams, but also think about the lessons learned from the not so positive events that we had in our lives. And I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much to all of you for taking part in our today's discussion, and stay healthy. Thank you.